Welcome to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Coast-to-coast challenges for the president out west. Biden manages the tricky balance with China, while back east, he's buffeted over Israel.
We are with Israel.
A pro-Israel march fills the streets of Washington, while hundreds of government employees fill their bosses' inbox with dissent.
No, I did not elbow him.
Sending more than letters, members of Congress get huffy while the funding deadline looms.
The impacts we're seeing are only going to get worse.
Meanwhile, the earth warms and the costs rise. Hello, thank you for joining us. We begin our report with the Israeli military confirming that it is moving in on Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. The hospital has been caught in the crossfire for several days, and the White House and Pentagon confirmed Tuesday that Hamas has been using tunnels underneath hospitals, including Al-Shifa, to hold hostages. Doctors say the facility has no food, water, or electricity to power ventilators and incubators for babies. The war drew thousands of demonstrators to our nation's capital Tuesday to support Israel. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes shows us what's happening here at home and what's happening on the front lines.
Israeli tanks surround Gaza's largest hospital, which U.S. officials say is doubling as a command and control hub for Hamas. Still, the U.S. urged Israel today not to fire any more munitions at Al-Shifa Medical Center amid reports of incubators failing, babies dying, and a mass grave being dug on hospital grounds to dispose of dozens of bodies.
We do not want to see a firefight in a hospital where there are innocent civilians.
As the conflict moves into its sixth week, Gaza is gripped by a full-blown healthcare crisis. In northern Gaza, there is just one functioning hospital left. CBS News heard from one of the doctors there.
There's over 500 wounded, and there's only 2 operating rooms, where 3 surgeons and an obstetrician providing care for the whole of Gaza City.
At the White House today, President Biden expressed rare optimism about the potential for a deal to free some of the roughly 240 hostages, including up to 9 Americans who are currently being held by Hamas.
I've been talking with the people involved every single day. I believe it's going to happen, but I don't want to get into detail.
But the Israeli Defense Forces confirmed today that one of the hostages, a 19-year-old female Israeli soldier, had been killed.
We will no longer stay silent.
On the National Mall in Washington, D.C. today, thousands gathered to show support for Israel amid a wave of anti-Semitism here at home.
From the river to the sea.
Rebecca Hammerman, who is Jewish, brought her 14-year-old down from Westchester, New York.
What's been the hardest part about all of this as a mom?
You know, I think as a mom, all you want is for your kids to feel safe and secure. And I think this has sort of shaken us and made us feel less safe than we have ever really felt before.
Goldie Zazone is a sophomore at Rutgers University and the great-grandchild of Holocaust survivors.
I feel like what we're going through right now is exactly what happened to them in 1940, the year before the Holocaust began.
And Nancy joins us for more. Nancy, I'm curious about President Biden's optimism there. He says he thinks a deal can be reached on the hostages held by Hamas. Is there anything more behind that? And what's this is obviously taking longer than officials had hoped. How much leverage does the White House really feels it has in these negotiations?
Right. Unfortunately, White House officials weren't willing to put any more meat on that bone and provide details that would back up that optimism. And the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was asked about it today. And all he said, John, was that this is what they're working towards every day, and that if he has any information, he will let reporters know. So it's unclear what exactly the president was referring to, what gives him that optimism. We had been hearing yesterday that there might be some sort of deal afoot where Hamas would hand over many of the women and children it's been holding in exchange for a 5-day ceasefire. But we haven't heard anything since then to indicate that that kind of arrangement is close at hand.
Let me ask you about how they see this march today at the White House. Obviously, the march is in part to push back against anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. But is there any pressure that they feel at the White House as they've increased talk about what they think Israel should and shouldn't do going into Gaza, whether that's partially the message that was coming from this march? In other words, that those who support Israel in America think the White House is starting to get a little weak on Israel?
Sure, and I think there was certainly a sense among the individuals that I spoke to down at the march today, John, that what you see in the news, what people have been hearing, are these pro-Palestinian marches around the country, rallies, that sort of thing. And they felt that the long-standing U.S. support of Israel was getting a little bit lost. That's why so many people, tens of thousands of people, traveled here to Washington from certainly all over the eastern seaboard and even farther. I saw hundreds of school children who came down here today to be at what was, for the most part, a very joyous celebration on the National Mall. People more than happy to talk about both their religion and their support of Israel, and about the fact that, on the darker side, on the negative side, that many of them for the first time in their lives are experiencing direct anti-Semitism on a regular basis and feeling more frightened about their personal safety than they ever have before.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. Thank you very much, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Over the last 4 weeks, the attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have increased, according to U.S. officials. There have been at least 56 attacks since October 17th. The most recent occurred Tuesday at Mission Support Site Euphrates in Syria. But there were no casualties or damage. Overall, officials say 59 U.S. service members have sustained minor injuries in the last month. 28 have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. Out of the 535 members of Congress, 99.66% pretty much behaved themselves on Tuesday. They attended hearings, answered constituent inquiries, kept their hands to themselves. Not all did that, though. In the Senate, Republican Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma challenged the Teamsters president to a fight. He objected to a 5-month-old tweet in which the labor leader characterized the senator's behavior in previous hearings as a, quote, tough guy act for show. In the House, Speaker Johnson said it's a pressure cooker. It is. He was able to pass a bill Tuesday to keep the government funded, but did it with Democratic help, a move that caused his predecessor his job. It was clear some of the pressure from that episode back a month ago was still left over. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane has the report.
Congress's gridlock nearly turned into a headlock.
If you want to run your mouth, we can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Oklahoma Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin, a former mixed martial arts fighter, challenged Teamsters President Sean O'Brien, who'd been blasting Mullin on social media as a clown and a fraud.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on. Oh, stop it.
Vermont's Bernie Sanders had to step in.
Sit down. Sit down. Okay. You're a United States Senator. Sit down.
Active.
Oh, okay.
Sit down, please.
But was it necessary to do something so provocative at that hearing?
I don't know what provocative is. I mean, he's the one that said stand up.
Tempers flared across the Capitol in the House as well, with accusations of a physical attack by one member on another.
It was in this basement hallway where Tennessee Republican Tim Burchett, who helped vote to out Kevin McCarthy as Speaker last month, says McCarthy elbowed him in the back. Burchett was doing a radio interview here at the time, and the microphone picked up some of the audio.
Why'd you elbow me in the back, Kevin? Hey, Kevin, you got any guts?
Jerk. Burchett then ran after McCarthy.
What kind of chicken move is that?
You're pathetic, man. You are so pathetic.
What a jerk.
You need security, Kevin.
McCarthy said it was an accidental bump in a crowded hall.
I'm not hitting somebody. If I hit somebody, they would know I hit them.
So you're quite confident this was deliberate?
Oh, yeah. Come on. I'll take a polygraph test.
Scott MacFarlane joins me now from Capitol Hill. All right, Scott, the business of the House was actually done. There was a vote. So how is Speaker Johnson's bill, the one that passed, materially different than the one that got Kevin McCarthy bounced from the speakership? Because he got bounced for working with Democrats. Speaker Johnson also worked with Democrats.
Oh, it's not terribly different. There's one quirk to it. It funds 1/3 of the government through January, and the other 2/3 through February, and that other 2/3 includes the military, the Pentagon. So there's two different bites at the apple members will have to do the things they want to do with spending bills. It's very similar to what Kevin McCarthy did. He did it without that quirk. But there's one dynamic that you saw play out in that report. There is clearly a fatigue among members of Congress. They've been here for 10 straight weeks. That's a lot of weeks in a row. They've had all the stress and strain of the standoffs, the brinksmanship, from the debt ceiling to the government shutdown to all the acrimony that's built in a narrow majority. And that frustration and that fatigue might have been what manifested itself today with some of those exchanges, but also might have been a tool for Mike Johnson to use to get everybody to resign themselves to passing a bill that nobody really likes, but that nobody hates.
Which often used to be the old-fashioned definition of actually legislating in a place where you have people of different parties and a narrow margin. So if Congress accepted reality that bipartisanship was necessary and they approved government funding, any chance that that reality might hold over into the new year where they're going to have to confront all of these issues all over again and reality won't have changed? Any chance that that might actually affect the negotiations on those funding bills that they've just continued but are still going to have to be figured out?
And John, we brought that question to a lot of people through the course of the day, and the opposite dynamic seems to be the fear that it is bottling up like a shook-up bottle of seltzer for January, that the Republicans who gave the new House Speaker a pass this time will be less likely to do so next time, cutting a deal with Democrats, and that there's going to be a politically forceful attempt to exact more cuts, more controversial policy riders, and the next battle could be the long one that leads to a protracted government shutdown, because the political chemistry here hasn't changed one bit. You still have a very narrow margin. Republicans who think that leadership's going too soft on Democrats. Democrats in the Senate saying you got to cut us into these deals or nothing actually happens. That dynamic, that political calculus doesn't change, even though they've hit the snooze button for a second time.
I will leave editorial comment aside. Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill, thank you so much for your reporting, Scott.
Thank you.
The man accused of attacking the husband of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi with a hammer last year testified on Tuesday. David DePep did not deny attacking Paul Pelosi. He claims he went to the Pelosi home as a part of a larger scheme to root out what he described as corruption in U.S. government. DePep has pleaded not guilty to attempted kidnapping of a federal official and assault on a family member of a federal official. Closing arguments are expected to begin Wednesday. Inflation is coming down. What this means for your wallet and the country's financial outlook. Plus, a new report from the White House paints a dire picture of the state of climate change, but there are some areas of improvement. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. The Labor Department says the rate of inflation, which measures how much prices are rising, fell to 3.2% in October. This is a significant drop from the high point of 9.1% about a year and a half ago. The decrease comes after aggressive interest rate hikes from the Federal Reserve, which makes borrowing expensive, slowing spending and investment. That drop in demand encourages retailers to lower prices to bring back customers. But inflation is still above pre-pandemic levels. Before 2021, the last time rates were above 3% was 2011. Compared to the last 80 years, today's inflation rate is lower than peaks in the 80s, 70s, and after World War II. One place Americans can see lower prices is at the gas pump. AAA says the national average for a gallon of regular gas is $3.35. That's down 26 cents from a month ago. The Wall Street Journal reports gas prices are falling due to lower demand and increased oil production here in the United States. The Journal also says prices could be easing due to Russian and Iranian oil entering worldwide supply despite U.S. sanctions. Frances Stacy joins us now. She's the Director of Strategy at Optimal Capital. Thank you so much for joining us. Why is inflation coming down, and do we think it's going to stay there?
Well, inflation is decelerating because, as you pointed out, the higher the cost of capital, meaning the more people have to put on credit cards and the more people have to pay for those credit cards, the less spending they're willing to do to keep up with everything. And so then that lowers the demand. And then, as you say, the stores have to lower their prices in order to keep consumers purchasing items. And even though inflation has decelerated a tremendous amount from going up 9.1%, it's still going up. Prices are still going up. They're just going up at a slower rate. So this is putting more and more pressure on consumers.
And I was struck at when this number came out that a number of the newsletters I follow and other people who write about the economy and think about the economy, suddenly we're talking about cuts from the Federal Reserve. So we went from, well, it's going to be another rate raise to, no, they're holding it steady, to now the consensus seems to be that rate cuts might be coming. Explain that to me if you think that's possible or why people would be suddenly thinking that.
Well, market participants really try to anticipate everything in advance. And so markets, that's how we cause volatility, is because when we don't perfectly anticipate things as investors, then we have to violently reprice something. So what happens is there are sort of three components to the future of inflation, which is the rate of inflation that's going up, in this case, going up, the rate of growth, and what we anticipate the Fed is going to do about that. And then market participants watch things like credit spreads, because what's really happening is how you measure inflation for our viewers out there is it's the amount of money in the system juxtaposed to the amount of goods in the system. And so the Fed tries to ameliorate inflation and control it by reducing the amount of money in the system. But the problem is that when they reduce the amount of money in the system, if they do it too much, you can't service the debt in the system. And that's when you see things like what happened in 2008, where you saw, a debt crisis. So that's the tightrope that Jay Powell has to walk. And market participants are constantly monitoring indicators. And what the indicators are telling us now is that inflation is going down. So the Fed will be less aggressive going forward, meaning the rates that are there now are priced in. And they're not seeing any of the quintessential signs that we have problems in the credit markets, with credit spreads and things like that going higher. So we're in this very sweet spot where these interest rates have gone up tremendously. Inflation has dropped. We don't have credit problems. And so markets rallied on that today.
The credit agency Moody's downgraded U.S. debt in part citing dysfunction in Washington. So we've just seen a vote to continue funding the government for a little while longer, but the dysfunction is still in Washington. How might that affect the future of credit and of interest rates?
Well, the thing about it is that basically the Federal Reserve has been lowering its balance sheet, basically, which is reducing the money supply. Some of the buffer that comes into the money supply is the fiscal spending. So personally, I'm glad to see moderation win the day. And I'm glad to see that market participants have some sort of consistency to price in the market. The risk of the government shutdown and the fracas in Washington not being able to reach an agreement is entering volatility and uncertainty and risk into the marketplace, which tends to kind of hurt investors. We don't have a choice. We have to service the debt. We have to fund the government. The government cannot cease to exist. And so, even though the fiscal spending was very, very high during COVID, you have to bring it down very, very slowly. You have to ameliorate it. You have to, take these things into account very, very slowly because people are dependent upon it.
Frances Stacey with Optimal Capital. Thank you so much for walking us through all that. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Climate change is threatening nearly every aspect of the lives of Americans in every part of our country. That's according to a sweeping new report from the federal government. CBS News national and environmental correspondent Ben Tracy takes a closer look at some of the key takeaways.
Stronger storms, devastating drought, heat waves, and wildfires. The new National Climate Assessment says the effects of climate change in the U.S. are now far-reaching and worsening.
It's affecting Americans right now, no matter where they live.
Climate scientist Kate Marvel worked on the assessment.
Are we running out of time
to avoid the worst impacts of climate change?
We are the last generation that is really going to be able to make a meaningful difference in the outcome.
In the U.S., there is now a $1 billion weather disaster on average every 3 weeks, compared to 3 per year in the 1980s, costing $150 billion. The report says U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from the burning of fossil fuels, are falling, but not quickly enough. Yet wind and solar power are rapidly expanding, now cheaper than burning coal.
The future is very much in human hands, and our choices are really going to determine how hot it's going to get in the future.
And Ben Tracy joins us now from Los Angeles. So, Ben, we see a lot of dire climate reports. Tell us what the point is of this particular one.
So, John, the National Climate Assessment is actually mandated by Congress, and it comes out about every 5 years. And this is compiled by several federal agencies with the input of hundreds of climate experts and climate scientists from around the country. And unlike a lot of the other climate reports that we see that really kind of tell you the state of climate change around the world, this is focused squarely on the United States. So this is about the risks, the impacts of climate change on the U.S., and it's basically used to inform planning not only at the federal level, but also at the state and local level in years to come.
And the economic assessment that is included, what does it say on that front?
Yeah, that's a new thing that they have done this time around for the National Climate Assessment. And, you know, in addition to that $150 billion in disasters that the country is now facing every year, which is taking a huge economic toll, they actually found that for every 1 degree of warming, and that's Fahrenheit, there is a 0.13 percentage point drag on the U.S. economy. Now, that sounds like a very small number, but when you compound that over many years, it really can add up. So they're saying down the road, when we're talking about decades of compounding climate change, this will have a real impact on GDP in this country. There's also an issue for homeowners where you have insurers that are pulling out of a lot of these very vulnerable areas where you've had massive wildfires over and over again, or you have hurricane threats. And so that is a real cost for homeowners. And some homeowners are worried about their property values dropping if they can't get insurance on their homes.
And does the report include only these dire assessments, or is there a solutions tab people can turn to for a little comfort?
It would be nice if it was as simple as a tab, but there is some good news in this report. There are solutions. I mean, the one big thing, job number one, is basically to move as quickly as we can off of fossil fuels into cleaner, renewable forms of energy, because fossil fuels are what are creating these greenhouse gas emissions. That is what is warming the planet. There was some great data in this report where they show that the costs of wind and solar power have dropped dramatically in the last decade. For wind power, it's a 70% drop in cost. For solar power, it's a 90% drop in cost. Those used to be real barriers to get over, and that those technologies were more expensive than burning coal or burning natural gas. And now it's actually cheaper. So the rapid deployment of renewable energy is a big solution here. It's a big weapon in the fight against climate change.
Ben Tracy in Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, John.
Ohio Republicans are looking to strip the state courts of the power to interpret a new abortion rights amendment. Voters last week chose to enshrine abortion and other reproductive rights into the state constitution. 2 days later, 4 state GOP lawmakers announced a plan to limit the amendment known as Issue 1. They claim it doesn't repeal any abortion laws in the state, and the language is, quote, dangerously vague. Typically, it would be up to the courts to answer questions on vague laws, but lawmakers said they will push to have the legislature alone make decisions about the amendment. Republicans hold a wide majority in Ohio's House and Senate. We've all had this happen. You do a round of repairs, come inside satisfied with your handiwork, and then realize you've left your tools behind. What hasn't happened to most of us is that the tools floated away. That's what happened to the kit belonging to astronauts Jasmine Moghbeli and Laurel O'Hara, who were doing maintenance during a spacewalk on November 1st at the International Space Station. After returning, they realized they'd left their bag outside. NASA later spotted it floating about 250 miles above the Earth. It's now become one of about 35,000 pieces of space junk, other things including parts of rockets and obsolete satellites that could pose a risk to the satellites that people actually need. Experts say some pieces in orbit are as big as a school bus. Illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border fell last month. We will discuss what's behind that decrease. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Here's some additions to our top stories. Tens of thousands of people marched in Washington to support Israel. Attendees included Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Speaker Mike Johnson, and House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. DHS called it a level 1 security event, but thankfully no violence was reported. The House passed a short-term funding bill Tuesday. It was a 336-95 vote, with 93 Republicans and 2 Democrats voting against it. Senate leaders have signaled their support for the bill, which needs to be signed by the president by Friday to avert a shutdown. The road to the deal with the United Auto Workers Union is having some speed bumps. Union members at a General Motors plant in Tennessee have voted against the proposed contract with GM. This comes after GM workers in Michigan and Ford workers in Kentucky also voted against the contracts. Illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border fell in October. It was the first drop in 3 months, but apprehensions are still at historically high levels. Data released Tuesday by U.S. Customs and Border Protection showed there were more than 188,000 migrant arrests last month. That's a 14% decrease from September. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez joins me now from Washington. Camilo, why the drop?
Good evening, John. Well, Border Patrol has recorded a reduction in illegal crossings along the U.S.-Mexico border across demographics. They saw a drop in apprehensions of migrants from several countries and of single adults, families with children, and unaccompanied minors, John. But the most notable decrease occurred among Venezuelan migrants. In October, about 30,000 Venezuelan migrants entered Border Patrol custody. That's a 46% drop from September, when more than 50,000 Venezuelans entered Border Patrol custody. That was a monthly record. And this has coincided with the Biden administration's decision, John, to start deportation flights, direct deportation flights to Venezuela for the first time in U.S. history. And Biden administration officials certainly believe that that is the reason why we have seen this dramatic drop, particularly among Venezuelan migrants. They believe that while only a small fraction of Venezuelans are being deported on these flights, they have been able to send a message of deterrence across the region and to convince migrants from Venezuela to stay put wherever they are.
But arrests still remain historically high. So
Yes.
What are some of the other major factors keeping these numbers up?
Well, the reason that migration levels are still at historically high levels, John, is because the fundamental dynamics of these issues are still there. They have not been mitigated significantly. The push and pull factors that drive migration and that have fueled these unprecedented levels of crossings since President Biden took office are still there. You still have this widespread economic crisis and repressive government in Venezuela. You still have a political issue and crisis in Haiti, and you have other push factors in countries in Central America and in the broader region of Latin America. And you also have the fact that only a small number of Venezuelan migrants are actually being deported. And officials told me that deterrence effect from these deportation flights could become more limited in the future once Venezuelan migrants learn that the risk of being deported is not very large. And so that is still a concern for U.S. officials. And we have to remember, John, that this is just not a crisis about Venezuelan migrants. U.S. officials have actually been recording sharp increases in arrivals of what they call extracontinental migrants, John. These are migrants from places like Africa, India, Russia, and even China, who are journeying across the globe, flying to South America, crossing multiple countries to get to the U.S.-Mexico border, and that is a very concerning trend for the Biden administration.
Before I let you go, Camilo, a bipartisan group, you've been reporting on this, there's a bipartisan group of senators discussing potential policy changes at the border. What can you tell us about that, and is there any chance that this might be any better than all the other bipartisan efforts that have not gone anywhere?
Well, that's a key question, John, a group of Democratic, Republican, and independent senators are right now negotiating a potential deal on border and asylum policy. It is limited to that issue, not to a broader comprehensive package on, for example, dealing with the undocumented population here. And while obviously, as you mentioned, Congress has not passed a significant change to the immigration system since 1996, 27 years ago, there are several reasons, John, why this could be different. The first one is that it is taking place in the context of President Biden's national security package, which includes aid to Israel, Ukraine, and border security money. And Republicans, John, have been saying that they will not pass any additional aid to Ukraine unless they get border policy changes. So that is a big factor. And the other factor here, John, is that, as you know, the Biden administration and the White House are under intensifying pressure politically, not just from Republicans, but from Democratic leaders in New York, Chicago, and elsewhere to limit the number of people entering the U.S. So there's this political pressure, in addition to the fact that Republicans are conditioning aid to Ukraine to concrete policy changes at the border. And Senator Sinema told me last week, the independent from Arizona, John, that she believes that there is widespread recognition among Democrats and Republicans that something needs to be done to address what she called a porous border.
Widespread recognition, but the solution is tricky as always. Camilo Montoya Galvez, thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
For average Americans, homeownership is a dream that's becoming more and more difficult to reach. According to a survey by the National Association of Realtors, the median income of a home buyer hit a record $107,000 last year, meaning they made roughly 40% more than the median American household. Buyers made 22% more than house hunters did in 2021, a necessity due to rising prices and mortgage rates. The survey also found single women bought more homes than single men last year, despite making less on average. Researchers chalk that up to the fact that women tend to live longer. In fact, new data shows men in the United States die nearly 6 years before women. That's based on new research published in the journal JAMA Internal Medicine. In 2021, women had a life expectancy of roughly 79 years compared to 73.5 years for men. That's the largest gender life expectancy in almost 30 years. Researchers say COVID-19 and drug overdoses contributed to the trend. Americans feel like they're tipping more often than they have in the past, but only about 1 in 3 people have confidence they know where and when they should. A Pew Research poll shows how Americans are navigating uncertainties around gratuity. In an age where people are more likely to tip their barista through a prompt on a checkout screen than through a tip jar, only 1 in 4 people do that routinely. Even fewer people tip at fast casual restaurants, and Americans are fairly split on whether or not to give drivers something extra for their time, with 61% of people tipping in taxis or through rideshare apps. We are tracking some storms in the Gulf that could bring flooding to Florida. For more, here's meteorologist Chris Warren from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Some wet times on the way for the Sunshine State. A lot of clouds expected. With those clouds will come rain day after day of light rain, moderate rain. Some of the wettest spots will be along the Panhandle, the northern part of the state, and in South Florida. Some areas, Miami-Dade, even to Monroe County, could see 5 to 8 inches of rain with this. And then by the end of the week, we're expecting an area of low pressure to develop somewhere around Florida, and it will eventually work its way up with its moisture into the northeast. Coastal low could bring some strong gusty winds as well to parts of the northeast. And then late in the week, with that wet weather, temperatures are actually going to be a little bit warmer than average, a lot warmer than average in parts of the upper Midwest. See 10 to 20 degrees warmer than what you would expect for this time of year. For more in-depth coverage, watch the Weather Channel on cable and now live on your favorite TV streaming device.
Chris Warren, thank you. China's president is making his first trip to the United States in 6 years. Coming up, the economic realities that led Xi Jinping to meet President Biden in San Francisco. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. When the leaders of the two largest economies meet in San Francisco Wednesday, don't expect any breakthroughs on policy. Instead, look for what President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping say about working together to improve their respective economies. While significant issues exist, they both have an interest in cooperation there. While the United States has been spending months fighting against inflation, China has the opposite problem. Prices there are falling, and many consumers are reluctant to spend their money. As a result, Chinese businesses struggle, and the economy's overall growth shrinks. President Biden says the U.S. can help.
We're not trying to decouple from China, but what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better. From my perspective, if in fact the Chinese people who are in trouble right now economically, if the average citizen in China was able to have a decent paying job, that benefits them and it benefits all of us.
And let's bring in Zoe Liu. She is a Maurice R. Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's step back here. What is the root of China's current economic challenges?
Thank you very much, John, for having me. China's current economic malaise can be analyzed through different lenses, and the framework that I use to analyze China's current economic challenges is through the so-called 4Ds, including debt, demand, demographics, and finally, decoupling or de-risking. And I'll stop there, but I'm happy to explore more.
So the U.S. can't help with demographics. So that's one of the Ds that in this current negotiating context, they can't fix. What about the other three? Is there an obvious area there where in these negotiations, the U.S. and China could make an agreement that would help with China's underlying economic issues?
John, you are right. The demographic issue probably is not something that the United States or U.S. government could help. However, the rest of the 3Ds, actually, U.S. has a lot the United States can help a lot with. To begin with, in terms of decoupling or de-risking, I think the Biden administration has been constantly sending the signal saying that the United States does not intend to decouple from China. However, the policies from export controls to investment screening, both inbound and outbound, seems to send mixed signals as viewing it from Beijing's perspective. Although the Biden administration have been saying that our purpose, the goal of our policies is really to prevent the Chinese army or the Chinese military to have access to advanced U.S. technologies to enhance their own combat and technological capabilities. But Chinese business, Chinese people, as well as Chinese policymakers view it as containment. So from that perspective, this summit is an opportunity to clear the air. And then the second aspect of that, in terms of demand, this becomes a little bit tricky in that demand comes from two sides. One is export, the other is domestic demand. While the United States can help in terms of balancing the trade, but the balancing the trade meaning that China should import more. So that becomes a little bit tricky. And then finally, in terms of debt, I think here this is another area where the United States probably can, especially U.S. finance industry, U.S. financial service industry, can help China in terms of improving the reporting and accounting system, but in terms of solving the fundamental root cause of the China's debt problem, especially the property sector, there is really little that the U.S. government or U.S. financial system can do.
So in this question of decoupling, as I understand it, that essentially means making sure that there are that the United States, both its government and its businesses, are less dependent on China for important goods or important markets, that basically it puts distance with China. I have sort of two questions, but they're related. What could President Biden offer that would show this decoupling is not taking place? And then the second part is President Xi is meeting with American businesses. They would like to stay in touch with the Chinese market. So might he get signals about a continued connection when he has those meetings with private industry?
John, you are absolutely right in that you identified the two pieces here. One is the U.S. government, and then the other piece, which is actually very much important, the U.S. business. And oftentimes we seem to not necessarily separate the two together. From the U.S. government perspective, I think it is very difficult at this moment for President Biden to communicate to President Xi Jinping the idea that U.S. is not intending to decouple from China, because from President Xi Jinping's perspective, a lot of this export controls mechanism is really targeting, or the goal is to stop China from growing. Therefore, I think it's important for President Biden to communicate directly, saying that there are direct causal mechanisms that the Chinese government, especially since President Xi Jinping came into power, for example, he's Made in China 2050, and President Xi Jinping's elevation of civil-military fusion strategy as a national strategy, a lot of this directly contributed to concerns of the U.S. government. Therefore, we reacted by export controls, specifically in limited sectors that can have a military implication. And then in terms of business, I think right now business executives are facing a really difficult time, because the Chinese market has never been perfect. However, the attractive of the Chinese market has been that there is policy predictability. Therefore, if President Xi Jinping really wanted to invite American business communities back into China, he would literally have to communicate and ensure, or providing some reassuring message that government is not necessarily going to disappear foreign executives or impose exit bans. And more importantly, he's going to restore policy predictability.
All right. Zoe Liu with the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Nepal this week became the latest country to restrict the use of TikTok. The nation's foreign minister said the app disrupted social harmony and goodwill. The United States, Britain, and New Zealand have banned TikTok on government devices over the national security concern that because the app is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance, the Chinese government could abuse user data or weaponize the platform. Still ahead, artificial intelligence, robots, and oxygen on Mars. It sounds like science fiction, but it's not. We'll show you what scientists are working on. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Researchers in China have developed an artificial intelligence robot that could help make oxygen on Mars. The robot used Martian meteorite samples to make a chemical catalyst that extracts oxygen from water. It was able to complete the experiment within 6 weeks by simulating Mars's sub-zero temperatures. The study's authors say it could have taken 2,000 years of human trial and error, sorting more than 3.7 million formula for the process. Scientists hope this breakthrough will make it possible for people to eventually live on Mars. And now to a story that does not include artificial intelligence, or maybe not even intelligence at all. Crocs is teaming up with McDonald's to release a new line of footwear inspired by the fast food giant. The collection is inspired by 4 of McDonald's iconic mascots. Crocs is also offering limited edition socks and charms to go with the shoes. The items retail for as little as $20 and as high as $75. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering in our next hour. The Israeli military says its forces are carrying out a targeted operation inside Gaza's largest hospital as it searches for hostages. Plus, the House passes a short-term funding bill to prevent a government shutdown, but not without some drama between lawmakers. And high stakes in San Francisco. President Biden and China's Xi Jinping are meeting there Wednesday. We'll tell you what to expect. You're streaming CBS News.